of Ukraine for his statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you, sir. Indeed, I wish to comment on the statements delivered by some of our colleagues, what they have stated during their statements. I will begin with my friend Christophe. I don't know who told them what I said, but the way that he interpreted my statement makes it clear that it was restated in an inaccurate manner. I can bilaterally quickly restate my statement if you so wish, bilaterally. But I will not dignify my British colleague with a response to his numerous questions. And this is not due to a lack of respect for my distinguished colleague. This is simply due to the fact that these responses, you do not need, rather, these responses. He lives in his own paradigm, within his own paradigm, and those questions, for him, those questions he has put forward are rhetorical questions. They also contain the responses which he wishes to hear, and he has no need for other responses. Incidentally, I proposed from my British colleague that he visit Crimea personally, and that he take a look at the so-called quote-unquote suffering of Crimeans, including Crimean Tatars, and so that he can draw his own conclusions rather than reading out the narrative which is duly provided to him by the British Foreign Office. Incidentally, in Crimea, it is possible to familiarize yourself with the educational system. And in 3 state languages, Russian, Ukrainian, and Crimean Tatar language, which our American colleague was so concerned about today, and not a word, however, was mentioned about the topic of today's meeting, and in no way did he even comment on the words of the High Commissioner on national minorities, who indeed said a great deal of provided a great deal of interesting information. We believe that members of council, we trusted, we saw that they would do everything possible to avoid discussion of the actual topic. Today, they spoke about many issues, but not what we proposed that be put forward for the discussion. And this is truly no surprise to us. We have long been attempting to convey to you that the picture you're painting in your imagination, which is duly being delivered to you by the Ukrainian authorities about freedom-loving, democratic Ukraine engaged in an uneven struggle with a brutal aggressor. This has nothing to do with reality. You do not hear that the situation in reality, in fact, is far from your imagination, or rather the myth which you have created for yourselves. Or more accurately, you simply don't wish to hear it. You do not wish to understand that your indulgence towards Kiev prompts a feeling of lawlessness and all permissiveness and impunity. You don't wish to hear that in reality what is happening in Ukraine is enmity and hostility being cultivated in society vis-a-vis Russia. I'll propose 3 brief examples to illustrate that. Ukrainian television channel News One announced a television broadcast and a link with Russia One. A link with ordinary citizens, not politicians, was tracked to an unprecedented level by nationalists. Yesterday, information surfaced that the general producer of the channel was questioned by the Ukrainian security forces as part of, I quote, a criminal affair on encroachment upon on a state offense or treason. This was an attempt to create a television link. The building of the Ukrainian channel 112 Ukraine was fired with mortars by Kyiv for its plans to portray a documentary about the untold history of Ukraine by Oliver Stone, a well-known U.S. representative, U.S. director. They announced that there was a war against journalists, and the former head of the right sector, the deputy from the outgoing Rada, Dmitry Yarosh, counseled workers of the television channel to close to shut their mouths vis-a-vis those violations that had been perpetrated. For a year now, an individual has been behind in jail, the head of RIA Novosti Ukraine, Kirill Vashinsky, a journalist, and this is on an accusation of state treason for a report that he was conducting, for his reporting. These instances and examples abound. I can list many, but you simply do not wish to hear them. We regret the fact that some were unable to resist the temptation to use today's meeting in order to capitalize on the sensitive issue of the disaster of the Malaysian MH17. It's down in Ukraine in 2014, July of 2014. On the eve of the 5th anniversary of this tragedy, once again, we extend our most sincere condolences to the families of the dead. We believe that every family deserves to know the truth about what in fact occurred on that unfortunate day. For this reason, from the very beginning, we called for a thorough and impartial international investigation in line with Resolution 2166. And we repeatedly stressed our willingness to join and to deliver the necessary support. Unfortunately, we cannot call actions impartial, those actions of the joint investigative team comprised of Australia, Belgium, the Netherlands, Malaysia, and Ukraine itself. The questions vis-a-vis the proceedings of the work immediately surfaced after 4 out of 5 states on 7 August 2014 signed a confidential agreement which enabled the filtering of any information. Malaysia had long been stripped of an opportunity to fully participate in the investigation. I don't know whether you've heard that the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, during a meeting with journalists on 30 May, cast doubt on the outcomes or the results of the work of the group, and we concur with her opinion, with that opinion, that there is an impression that the purpose of the investigation is not to shed light on the circumstances of what took place, but rather to pin all blame on the Russian Federation. Incidentally, I'm surprised at the statement delivered by my friend Christophe. He referred to international law. He demonstrated an incredible level of legal nihilism, calling upon the Russian Federation to pay compensation for the victims when there haven't been any judicial proceedings, and nobody has been identified as the culprit yet. I wish to recall the fact that in October 2016, we conveyed the initial unredacted data, and we still are the only ones to have done so. Incidentally, I'd like to ask our U.S. colleague. He today is also talking about MH17. What are the satellite images from U.S. satellites about the crash site, which you have long spoken about, and the U.S. has refused to provide those satellite images? The representatives of the JIT during the recent press conference on 19 June were unable to respond to the question of why Russian data was not taken into account, but the data of other countries was not even provided. Just as they were unable to respond to the question of why there was a disregard of the origin of the origins of the rocket established by the Russian side after the demonstration, after the JIT itself demonstrated fragments of this rocket. The politicization of this to us is completely egregious and blatant. I will not speak in depth about the incident in the Kerch Strait. Simply, I would state that perhaps are you aware that Russia proposed to release those servicemen, to return them to Ukraine, provided that they consent to participate in criminal proceedings to take place in the Russian Federation. This idea was immediately rejected by Ukraine, the foreign minister, and then this was also rejected by President Zelensky and doubted by him. I won't talk about that, but I will read out just one quote about how the day before the inauguration of the president, the former deputy head of the presidential administration, Andrei Petrov, returned and initiated a suit for the State Bureau of Investigation vis-a-vis the action of former President Poroshenko in connection with the above-mentioned incident. I quote, "The above-mentioned instances were a consequence of planned illegal actions of an individual who at the time occupied the position of president of Ukraine and was the senior military commander of the armed forces of Ukraine. So Poroshenko deliberately, wittingly, as part of an organized group of individuals, having full information about the tensions in the Kerch Strait, and aware of the high likelihood of aggressive action by the Russian Federation's armed forces, fully understood the risks linked to his action in the risk to the life, health, and freedom of Ukrainian servicemen, and damages and loss of military equipment and weapons, instructed or consented to the instructions or decree to have a naval group of warships be transferred to the Ukrainian armed forces from the Black Sea and the Azov Sea through the Kerch Strait, which was fully under the control of the Russian naval forces. End of quote. So to conclude, Mr. President, I wish to tell my Ukrainian colleague the following. My Ukrainian colleague used the well-known policy of double think that the Ukrainian policy has, that the politicians in Ukraine have long favored. It seems that for the meeting on the anniversary to mark on the question of Russian troops in Donbass, it seems that not we responded, but OSCE representative responded, and this is something which recalls fully. The Ukrainian side obstinately is using the term Russian militants. Of course, they can be Russian, but there are many Russians in there. But these are all representatives of Donbass in the Russian Federation. Incidentally, he forgot to mention how many civilians in Donbass, in Lugansk, died as a result of shelling of the Ukrainian forces. These are civilians, and I stress this. Once again, I wish to stress, this was not Donbass that entered Kiev, but Kiev moved towards Donbass. I will not continue to describe the way the Ukrainian side has been sabotaging the Minsk agreement at present. The distinguished representative of Ukraine proposed the measures that need to be adopted to begin to resolve the conflict. But he spoke to the Russian side, again engaging in doublethink. Because we have said, we are saying, we'll continue to say, that so long as the Ukrainian side refuses to engage in direct dialogue with the representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk, not with Russia, there will be no progress in this conflict. I've said this many times in this chamber. Why is it that when we discuss other conflicts which unfortunately have engulfed the world, the Syrian, Yemeni, Libyan conflict, any other conflict, when we discuss those, we call upon the parties to sit down at the negotiating table, the parties to the conflict to sit down at that table, and we don't allege that external players need to supplant those parties to conflict only for Ukraine. Many of you, rather, are obstinately attempting to force Russia to speak to Ukraine, rather than those individuals in Donbass and Lugansk and Donetsk who are the direct parties to this confrontation. And lastly, the Ukrainian permanent representative mentioned that we are appointing and instructing for the Ukrainians what language needs to be spoken in Ukraine. We are not instructing this. This is your law, which instructs your citizens about what languages they are allowed to speak and what language they are not allowed to speak in. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de la Federación de
I thank the representative